Welcome to the Daily Horror Habit Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Krieger, bringing you daily reviews of currently streaming horror movies for your twisted pleasure. Be aware that these reviews may include mild spoilers. And as always, I hope you enjoy. For my money, Event Horizon is the best Hellraiser film that's not actually part of the Hellraiser franchise. Turns out blending Clive Barker's twisted vision of hell and wrapping it in a Warhammer 40k-esque package is, in fact, very much my shit. Currently streaming on Netflix, Event Horizon was released in 1997 and was directed by Paul W.S. Anderson, the man behind such films as Mortal Kombat, Resident Evil, and Alien vs. Predator. Event Horizon centers around an experimental spaceship of the same name, reappearing after being lost in space for years. An investigatory team led by Captain Miller, played by Lawrence Fishburne, is assisted by the ship's creator William Weir, played by Sam Neill, who must decipher the ship's mysterious reappearance, though it doesn't take long for the ship's horrifying past to catch up to them. Essentially, Event Horizon is a haunted house film set in space. And while that's an oversimplification, the film's approach in establishing its sci-fi setting and incorporating horror into that is a stunning example of how to blend genres. First and foremost, Anderson does a great job of establishing its sci-fi atmosphere. This is a grimy and filthy future where these billion-dollar spacecrafts have imperfections and seem almost hobbled together. The world is dripping with disdain for deep space travel. The crew themselves no longer wowed by deep space. They simply want to go home. It creates a very tense atmosphere from the jump before any scares even happen. It feels like a very hostile and lived-in world that helps to hold the viewer's attention and engagement until more hellish moments occur in the second half of the film. As far as horror movie characters go, Event Horizon's cast is far more competent than you might assume. There are far less forced character interactions, and each character is easily identifiable and brings different baggage with them. The standout performances for me being Sam Neill and Lawrence Fishburne. Sam Neill seeing how his character Weir adapts and begins to change as he becomes more enthralled by the Event Horizon and the things that are haunting the ship is really disturbing, and capturing his psyche is contrasted against the rest of the cast, but his descent into madness is the most apparent and the most shocking, and he takes on the most physical changes along with the most obvious mental changes. And then Lawrence Fishburne plays the very space-hardened captain of the crew, who's very stoic, and no matter what is going on, things that are occurring that are unexplainable, his way to kind of bring the entire group together really shows that this is a crew that has a history together. These don't feel like people that are kind of randomly assigned on a mission together. These are people that have traveled together. They know the ins and outs of not only their own ship, the Lewis and Clark, but one another. They know how to reassure one another. They know how to joke around with one another. And that camaraderie doesn't feel artificial, which is something that I think a lot of not only horror movies, but sci-fi movies in general sometimes. The crews kind of just feel like, hey, we just met, even if they're supposed to have been a crew that's worked together for a while. But the crew in Event Horizon very much feels like a family in a lot of ways. Now, once we learn that the ship has ventured to hell itself via a gravity drive, which was designed for deep space travel, film goes full Hellraiser. I'm going to keep making that comparison because I think it's an apt one. The crew begins to see visions and hallucinate traumatic events from their past, and sure, Event Horizon's imagery becomes increasingly disturbing and gory, but what makes it work so well is that it targets each crew member's deepest fears and regrets. This is something that I always look for in horror movies. Sure, anybody can have very bloody kills, they can have gory kills, people being dismembered, this and that, shocking things, but I think what makes for the best scares are scares that are personalized to each character, to their sensibilities, to their past, to their trauma, to that baggage that I mentioned earlier. Personalized scares make for smarter scares that are complemented by additional scenes of those gory kills that I was mentioning earlier. Gory kills on their own, I don't think really make for a strong horror movie. In fact, I think the weakest horror films, in my opinion, are the ones that are all gore, but there's no tension, there's no character development at all. It's just gratuitous violence for the sake of gratuitous violence. But at the same time, I think that gratuitous violence works in a film like Event Horizon because it complements the different personalized scares that I mentioned. And in that regard, Anderson really has a great job of conceptualizing this blending of genres that sets up the film as being this atmospheric sci-fi movie, but then includes the horror gore that I think complements kind of the vision of hell that he had in a lot of ways. And honestly, Event Horizon's such a simple film to describe, and yet it really does come together in a way that's more competent than it should be. Again, it's that atmospheric deep space sci-fi that isn't afraid to shock viewers with disturbing imagery. But again, you can't not feel for these characters as each of the scares is revealing and exploiting a past trauma. And I think that that comes across in a way that is really devastating in a lot of ways, because we're invested in these characters, and it's a pretty big crew that is investigating the Event Horizon. And while we get to know some more than others, at the same time, you're given enough to know about each character that when their fear and trauma is exploited by the Hell forces is really heartbreaking in a lot of ways. And I think that is also what makes Sam Neill's character, who is revealed to be the antagonist, who gets fully possessed by the gravity drive and the Hell portal, and essentially compelling him to give the Hell portal the new crew, the Lewis and Clark crew, is really heartbreaking, because you see that this is a man that had personal loss in his life, and that led him to completely fall into his work, and then to see his own baggage and trauma being exploited in a way that completely corrupts him and destroys him. For being an antagonist, at a certain point, I felt pretty sad for him. That's pretty heartbreaking to see somebody give themselves to their work in a way that they end up suffering in their personal life, and then a devastating event leads them to being completely vulnerable to corruption by this force. And again, I made a comparison early on to Hellraiser, and I think that's because it just captures the fear and shows characters in the audience a vision of hell that isn't just disturbing, but it's an all-consuming one of people's willpower, essentially. And Sam Neill serves as being an example of what happens when that willpower is completely corrupted and makes them vulnerable for manipulation. I really can't understate how much the film benefits from feeling like two distinct films early on. We have the Anderson setup is very much just a traditional sci-fi movie that really has some fantastic practical effects, especially for the Lewis and Clark and the Event Horizon ship. And the dedication that went into crafting those two with practical effects and models and whatnot really does serve as the pinnacle, I think, of late 90s practical work, in a way that a lot of those movies from that era, I feel, suffer from over-reliance on CGI and whatnot. That noticeable dedication really helps to establish the world and to make Event Horizon feel like a lived-in place again. Very much the little details that you can see in each of the ships, in terms of them being these billion-dollar monoliths, essentially. It's deep space monoliths, but then they kind of look like they're patched together in a lot of ways. They wear a lot of their that deep space exploration, those thousands of light years of miles that they've traveled. You can really feel the wear and tear on these ships, which helps to establish it as this grimy universe that is completely none of the characters are wowed anymore by, oh, we're in space, we can go to all these different planets and universe. In the end, deep space is completely empty and they just want to go home. In an era when we get a lot of clean and pristine sci-fi movies, in terms of not only the technology, but the kind of amazement at the wonder of deep space travel, this film remains an outlier in a way that is perfect for being paired with horror. And then, of course, once the film goes full Hellraiser, I'm going to keep using that, sorry, I apologize to Hellraiser fans, but I think it does a great job of showing what happens when people's willpower is completely destroyed, and exploiting that for personal gain, well, for Hell's personal gain, is really disturbing. And again, the dedication to making the crew feel as if they're an actual crew that has a history together, that cares for one another. Each character is easily identifiable by quirks or traits, their humor, their accent, their insight into different things, their skill set really goes a long way when people start getting killed off and you notice their deaths. I would say, with, not to say that Event Horizon is anything like a slasher movie, but I'll give an example of like a slasher movie. A majority of the time when a character is killed off, they're killed off and their death is notable because of the way they're killed, not so much that character's absence. Not all the time, but I find that that's often a recurring trait of slasher movies, or movies that have a considerable body count. And in terms of the body count, I think Event Horizon is paced really, really well. And again, it's not just because of the blending of genres, but it doesn't reveal things too early on. We're not greeted to a lot of in-your-face scares. The scares build very gradually, and that's what I love is tied into the kind of mystery aspect of the Event Horizon itself. The crew trying to decipher the clearly horrific events that occurred. They just don't have any concrete evidence yet. And until they have evidence, they're there to do their job. And seeing how the more evidence they begin to collect and the more strange hallucinations and visions they begin to have, and you see that fear kind of begin to cripple the group's willpower, is really, really well done. In terms of, again, it's something that I come back to often, is that the third act of a lot of horror movies is often the weakest, just because you've seen the monster, you've seen the killer and whatnot, and we have already been there's already been a reveal, so there isn't much mystery left. And the fact that Event Horizon is cloaked in mystery for a majority of the film, and when that third act fully explodes into the twisted vision of hell that Anderson portrays in the really brutal and horrifically shocking practical work, it's super affecting. And especially when, again, that investment in these characters makes that shocking depictions of violence and gore that much more heartbreaking and terrifying at the same time. Now is as good as time any to actually renaming the fun facts segment of the show Half-Assed Research. And here's some kind of just rapid fire facts that I found out about Event Horizon and some research. Anderson turned down an opportunity to direct X-Men. I think Anderson gets a lot of flack for mainly the Resident Evil movies, I think, from a lot of people, and that his basis over the last 10 years has a majority of the time been video game movies. So he did Mortal Kombat, and then he did, I think they've done 6 or 7 of these Resident Evils. He's moving on to Monster Hunter. But I think a lot of people forget that Anderson gave us Event Horizon, which is a film that I love more and more on every single viewing. And he also gave us Death Race, which is not a perfect film by any means, but it's an indication of him dabbling in multiple genre blendings. That film is very much like an action movie, a prison movie, but it's also has a very kind of grindhouse aesthetic, and it feels like a video game in a lot of ways, while not being as cartoony, I think, as some of the later Resident Evil movies became. So I'm thrilled that Anderson turned down X-Men to give us a more original horror-focused film such as Event Horizon, and I would hope that in the future he would pursue more films like this, maybe, for my money, moving away from video games and maybe taking some of the style and substance that he applies to those adaptations into something more original. The Event Horizon ship was designed to resemble Notre Dame Cathedral, which ship itself has a very distinct look and obviously design, and that ties into the film's religious undertones and dealing with hell and whatnot, and people having to repent for their sins and whatnot. So I think that that is, again, a very minute detail, but at the same time, it carries a lot of weight to it. Next up, Anderson had to cut 30 minutes of footage to avoid an NC-17 rating. This footage, he's stated, was mostly additional gore from the demonic hell sequences at the end, especially the kind of orgy video that is played of the captain's log. So I guess I would like to see some additional footage, but at the same time, if it's just kind of more of that, I don't know that it would necessarily complement the film. I think the film it's a little bit over 90 minutes, and I think that its length is pretty perfect. So anything that is more than that, I have a feeling would outstay its welcome. But at the same time, it's one of those instances where a director's vision had to be cut down to appease a ratings board, and now it's been revealed that that footage has either been lost or destroyed, which seems to be a trend with a lot of these types of movies that I would love to do some more research into to find out why that keeps happening, why that was such a prevalent issue with films of the 80s and 90s. That's another topic for another podcast. The film had to be completed in 10 months, which is absolutely insane to me, considering the amount of practical effects and the models that had to go into making for the film, in addition to writing a script and getting it edited and all that. And further supporting my description of Event Horizon being Hellraiser in space, which I'm sure Hellraiser fans are more than tired and have probably unsubscribed at this point in the podcast because they're tired of me saying that. Clive Barker himself, the author of Hellraiser, was actually around to offer advice during pre-production on the script and forming Event Horizon's horror aesthetic. That I think it's incredibly telling because, again, it's the first movie that I think of as being a direct influence on Event Horizon is Hellraiser. And for me, Clive Barker, I think he's really good at visualizing different depictions of hell. For me, though, like Hellraiser, it's a little too sleazy for me. I'm not invested in those characters nearly as much as I am in a film like Event Horizon. And I think that that complements Anderson's decision to make this film a blending of two very distinct genres in a way that it's a little more methodical in crafting the crew and the atmosphere and the world to support those scares. That's mostly just a personal feeling. I know Hellraiser has plenty of fans and whatnot, but for me, Event Horizon takes what I liked about Hellraiser and even made it better. And for my last fact, it turns out as recently as 2019, Amazon and Paramount Television were developing a series adaptation of Event Horizon, which, you know, I'm conflicted on a lot of these projects that we hear about pretty frequently now, where we're taking a film and we're going to break it up into an 8-part or a 10-part television series. I think with a film like Event Horizon, it could be done in a way considering it's a blending of genres. So we can have more of a reliance on a sci-fi storyline, or we could have more of a reliance on a horror episode. Now, the magic of Event Horizon might get lost in that if it doesn't kind of seamlessly blend the two, over the course of 8 episodes. If you have some episodes that lean more towards their survival and them trying to survive in deep space versus them exploring more into hell and the hell portal and seeing how that affects people, that could be the results on that could be varied. But at the same time, I think that it's a strong enough basis, and given it's such a simple film to describe, there's a lot of different avenues that you can run with. And I think if there was to be one horror film that you would want to kind of develop into a TV series, Event Horizon's probably close to the top of my list. But again, whether that ever comes to fruition, or if it does and it doesn't end up being successful in trying to expand upon Event Horizon's storyline in any way, doesn't matter, because we still have the film, and no television series or project or sequel or prequel, if they ever decide to develop for Event Horizon, will ever impact the impact of the original. And I can always go back and watch the original, so I'm not super opposed to the idea, even if it's not something that I would maybe be pining for after finishing the film. But we'll see if that project ever actually comes to light. In the meantime, however, I would definitely recommend people checking out Event Horizon. Again, it's currently streaming on Netflix, and I think it'll really resonate with fans of sci-fi and horror films alike. And that's going to do it for another episode of Daily Horror Habit. I'll see you guys tomorrow for another horror movie review. Thank you for listening to the Daily Horror Habit podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe on your desired podcast platform, or follow @Daily Horror Habit on Twitter and Instagram. Thanks for listening.